When she died in 1881, New Orleans held a funeral for a woman some believed could raise the dead. Others swore she was the devil's mistress. The truth? Much stranger. Her name was Marie Laveau, the most feared and revered woman in 19th century America. She healed the dying and terrified the living. She prayed in church at sunrise and led midnight rituals by moonlight. Depending on who you asked, she was a saint, a sorceress, or something the city had never seen before. A woman who ruled without a throne, and yet beneath every rumor was something real. A free woman of color navigating a world that worshipped her power and feared her skin. If you're still awake after the first curse, you might as well subscribe. It's the only protection you'll get tonight. And before we start, what time is it where you are? Midnight? Perfect. The veil's thinner then. Now, let the candles burn low. Let the city's noise fade. We're going back 200 years to a place where faith wore two faces, and one woman learned to command them both. You can almost smell it, damp brick, cigar smoke, and yesterday's rum. The air feels heavy, half asleep, like the city itself is recovering from the night before. It's dawn in early 19th century New Orleans. The streets of the French Quarter glisten with humidity and sin, and nobody seems too bothered about either. A church bell groans in the distance, answered by the faint pulse of a drum somewhere across town. One calls for repentance, the other for rhythm. That's New Orleans, a city that never quite decided whether it wanted to save you or seduce you. You walk along narrow cobblestones slick with dew. Balconies lean overhead, draped with curling ironwork and half-dead flowers. The air smells of magnolia, chicory, and frying dough. The sun rises late, brushing the rooftops like a painter who's already tired. Priests and drummers cross paths on their way to work, one blessing the wine, the other blessing the beat. Somewhere, a nun buys candles beside a woman selling charms. Both nod politely. Different tools, same goal. By the time Marie Laveau was born, the city had already changed hands more often than a deck of cards. The French founded it in 1718, the Spanish took it in 1762, and then Napoleon sold the whole thing to the United States in 1803 for $15 million, roughly the price of a modern New Orleans wedding. The Americans bought what they thought was farmland. What they got instead was a fever dream. It was a city of exiles, freed people, merchants, and mystics, a mix of French ambition, Spanish order, African rhythm, and Caribbean rebellion. The result was a place that looked European from a distance, but melted into something entirely its own up close. To live here was to live between worlds, between land and swamp, language and silence, heaven and heatstroke. Sundays revealed the city's two faces. The wealthy worshipped at St. Louis Cathedral, their lace fans fluttering. Meanwhile, just a few streets away, freed and enslaved Africans gathered at Congo Square, the only place in America where people of color were legally allowed to dance. Circles of women moved in bright scarves, men drummed, elders sang, and children clapped in time. To outsiders it looked chaotic. To those who understood, it was memory in motion, prayer disguised as music. The Americans who had just arrived were horrified. They'd come from Puritan towns where joy was considered suspicious. New Orleans was the opposite. It baptized babies in holy water and rum. It buried its dead above ground so they could flood politely every few decades. It believed in saints, spirits, and second chances, sometimes all at once. In this strange balance between the sacred and the profane, belief was business. Priests sold blessings, herbalists sold cures, and a few clever women sold both. The French Quarter was small, but the walls were thin. You could hear your neighbors' arguments through the shutters and smell their dinner cooking before they invited you. And the gossip, that was the real religion. Words carried power here. Secrets were currency. And that was the world that made Marie Laveau possible. Anywhere else, she would have been dismissed as a blasphemer or burned as a witch. But here, she was inevitable. New Orleans was built for contradictions. It was a place where a woman could pray in Latin at sunrise and summon spirits by midnight, and no one could say for sure which version of her was real. No one ever truly governed this city. Not the French, not the Spanish, not the Americans who bought it. But one woman, a hairdresser, a healer, a mystery, would come closer than anyone ever dared. Marie Laveau was born free, on paper at least. Around 1801, when she entered the world, freedom in New Orleans came with an asterisk. You could be free and still live under laws written for someone else's comfort. You could own property, but not always peace. You could walk the streets without chains, but never without eyes following you. Marie was born into that delicate in-between, neither enslaved nor truly equal. Her family were Creoles of color, free black descendants of Africans, Europeans, and native peoples, a small but vibrant class with its own schools, traditions, and sense of pride. They spoke French, worshipped in Latin, and whispered in Creole. They dressed like the French elite, but knew that no amount of lace could make the color of their skin invisible. Her grandmother, Catherine, had once been enslaved, but purchased her own freedom. A story told so often in Marie's household, it might as well have been a family hymn. Catherine saved coin by coin until she could buy her liberty, then built a small cottage on St. Anne Street. It was modest, yes, but in a city where freedom was fragile, walls you owned were more than shelter. They were proof. That cottage would become the heart of Marie's world. Imagine it. Wood walls painted the color of cream. The air thick with the smell of herbs drying on strings above the stove. Inside, Catherine taught her granddaughter how to survive in a world that only half approved of her existence. Some girls were raised to curtsy. Marie was raised to calculate. In one corner of the room stood a crucifix. In another, a clay jar filled with river stones, feathers, and candles. Marie grew up knowing both belonged. She learned that faith had many languages, some spoken in cathedrals, others whispered over water. Most children were scolded for asking too many questions. Marie was encouraged to listen instead, to the murmurs of the neighbors through the shutters, the sighs of the sick, the rhythm of rain against the roof. She absorbed the world like a sponge, its gossip, its prayers, its warnings. By 7, she could recite the rosary from memory and name every herb in her grandmother's garden. Rue for fevers, basil for protection, magnolia bark for strength. And on nights when thunder cracked open the sky, Catherine would mutter something in an older tongue, half prayer, half spell, and tell Marie to stay quiet, to let the storm pass through her, not around her. She learned early, you might say, that sometimes the saints were busy and you had to handle things yourself. Her mother, Marguerite, was quieter, though no less formidable. A woman of mixed ancestry, African, native, and European, Marguerite had inherited her mother's resolve, but carried it like a secret. She worked, prayed, and watched her daughter with a knowing expression, as if she could already see what the rest of the city couldn't, that the child she'd raised would one day command both reverence and fear. But that future was far off. For now, Marie was just another girl in a city bursting with contradictions. Other Creole girls were taught to embroider, to play the harp, to smile when men entered the room. Their mothers dreamed of respectable marriages and quiet lives. Marie's lessons were different. Catherine taught her which words to say in church and which to whisper to the river. She showed her that survival wasn't about pretending to be proper. It was about knowing when to appear harmless and when to appear holy. Freedom, in their world, was not a birthright. It was a performance. Still, there were moments of ordinary childhood. Trips to the market where vendors shouted in 3 languages. Evenings when she'd sit by the window, watching the lanterns flicker across the quarter. She'd see the grand ladies returning from Mass, their gloves spotless, their perfume chasing away the smell of the streets. And she'd think, quietly, curiously, how strange it was that people could look so pure while the city around them dripped with secrets. The Laveau home was a crossroads of cultures. Visitors came often, midwives, herbalists, women seeking blessings, men asking for advice they'd never admit needing. Marie would sit by the door, pretending not to listen as the adults spoke in low tones. Names were mentioned, favors were promised, candles flickered. Sometimes laughter followed, sometimes tears. Even as a child, she understood that power wasn't loud. It was traded softly, like gossip in the dark. In the evenings, when the air grew thick and restless, Catherine would tell her stories from the old days, about the spirits who guarded the river, about the ancestors who crossed the ocean with songs hidden in their hearts. Marie would listen, wide-eyed, the candlelight dancing in her gaze. Somewhere between those stories and her catechism lessons, something in her began to merge the two. To her, God and the spirits weren't rivals. They were co-workers. As she grew older, she began to see how fragile freedom could be. The Americans who had taken over the city brought new laws, new arrogance, and a suspicion of anyone who didn't fit neatly into their version of civilized. For Creoles of color, it meant that every privilege could vanish with a signature. The family learned to navigate politely, never too proud, never too visible. Marie, though, had a quiet defiance. When she walked through the quarter, she didn't bow her head like some others did. She greeted priests with the same nod she gave market women. She spoke French to the wealthy and Creole to the poor. Everyone liked her voice. It carried calm, confidence, and something else you couldn't quite name. By her teenage years, she'd grown into a presence, tall, striking, graceful, with eyes that seemed to know things before you said them. And though the city around her hummed with superstition, no one yet realized she would become the superstition. For now, she remained a child between worlds, the granddaughter of an enslaved woman, the daughter of a free one, and the future queen of a city that still didn't know what to call her. She didn't belong entirely to the church, nor to the spirits, nor to any man's law. She belonged to the in-between, the place New Orleans itself seemed to live. And perhaps that's why the city would love her so fiercely, and fear her even more. Before Marie Laveau ever led a ceremony, before anyone whispered her name in reverence or fear, the rhythm that would one day announce her already pulsed beneath New Orleans. You could hear it every Sunday afternoon if you stood near the old Place des Nègres, later called Congo Square, a dusty field just outside the French Quarter walls. The city called it a gathering ground. The truth? It was freedom on a schedule. According to the Code Noir, the French colonial Black Code, enslaved Africans were allowed one day of rest each week. Just one. Sunday. The other 6 belonged to their masters, but that single day, those precious few hours, belonged to them, and they used it beautifully. By late morning, the square would begin to fill. Women in bright skirts carried baskets of fruit and herbs to sell. Men hauled drums carved from hollowed trunks. Children darted between them, laughing, their voices like tiny cracks of sunlight. You could smell roasted corn, cane liquor, and something floral and earthy, maybe jasmine, maybe magic. From the quarter you might hear the first faint thump of drums mixing with the bells of St. Louis Cathedral. It was a strange duet, one calling for the soul, the other for the body. The city, as usual, tried to do both. Technically, it was illegal to be joyful, or at least too joyful. The Code Noir, written back in the 1720s, forbade African religion, music, and public assembly. But New Orleans had never been good at following rules, especially bad ones. The Spanish officials who later took over were too outnumbered and too tired to stop the Sunday gatherings. So they did what most New Orleanians do when confronted with overwhelming energy. They shrugged and joined the rhythm. Picture it. Hundreds of people dancing barefoot in the sun, their feet beating the packed earth into dust. Circles within circles, movements that echoed across oceans and centuries. The songs were in languages no overseer could understand. Melodies that carried homesickness, rebellion, and memory all at once. Some called it dangerous. Others called it divine. From the balconies near Rampart Street, curious onlookers leaned over to watch. White women in lace gloves whispered that it was sinful. Their husbands whispered that it was fascinating. Free Creoles of color, like Marie's grandmother, came too, not to dance, but to remember. For them, it was a glimpse of what their parents and grandparents had once been allowed to be, unbroken. You could almost feel the earth shift beneath the weight of it all, the music, the sweat, the longing. The drums weren't just instruments. They were archives, carrying stories too risky to speak aloud. Every rhythm was a sentence, every movement, an act of translation. When the musicians lifted their hands and the sound swelled, the whole city seemed to breathe differently. Shopkeepers paused mid-sale. The priest at St. Louis Cathedral hesitated between prayers. Even the Mississippi River, thick and slow, seemed to lean closer to listen. And somewhere, not far away, a young girl, Marie, perhaps 10 or 11, might have stood in the crowd's shadow, watching quietly. She wouldn't have joined in. Her grandmother wouldn't have allowed it. But she would have listened. She would have felt the rhythm under her skin, the way it called not to rebellion, but to belonging. She would have seen women moving in circles, hands raised, eyes half closed, whispering prayers that sounded suspiciously like songs. She would have noticed the offerings, bread, flowers, bottles of rum, placed carefully on the ground. It wasn't worship as the church taught it. It was worship as the heart remembered it. It's easy to romanticize it now, to imagine only the music and the joy. But this was still a city built on human suffering. The same people who danced freely on Sundays were back in chains on Monday. Some returned to kitchens, others to sugar fields, all of them to a world that measured their worth in labor. And yet, for those few hours, they created something the Code Noir could never regulate: a shared soul. The authorities tried, of course. They sent soldiers to observe, scribes to record, priests to frown disapprovingly. But no one could stop what happened when the drums began. Laws don't work on rhythm. As the decades passed, Congo Square became both a sanctuary and a symbol. It was a marketplace, a concert, a family reunion, a whispered rebellion. Enslaved men could trade small goods for coins. Women sold herbs, roots, and charms, remedies learned from ancestors the colonists claimed to have erased. The city's elite pretended it was harmless entertainment. Secretly, they feared it, because beneath the laughter and song was something dangerous: unity. Marie Laveau's generation inherited that rhythm like an heirloom. She didn't invent it. No one could, but she learned how to use it. Later, when her own ceremonies drew crowds to the bayou and the lake, the pulse of Congo Square would echo through every drum beat and chant. The city would call it voodoo, but for her, it was just continuity. The same rhythm that once gave her ancestors the courage to survive would give her the power to lead. By her teenage years, Congo Square had become a fixture of New Orleans life. Tourists and locals alike came to watch, pretending it was a show. They didn't realize they were witnessing something far older and more sacred than the city itself. Every Sunday, even the wind seemed to dance. Brass from the French Quarter mixed with drums from the square, and if you closed your eyes, you couldn't tell which was which. The sound was so complete, so alive, that it became the heartbeat of the city. That's what New Orleans was: a negotiation between heaven and earth, rhythm and restraint, rules and rebellion. And it was in that space, in the cracks between the law and the dance, that Marie's story began to form. The Code Noir might have written the city's laws, but the drums wrote its memory. They told every child, every freedwoman, every tired soul exactly who they were, even when the world refused to. And on one of those golden afternoons, with the music rising and the bells chiming faintly in the distance, a young girl would realize something she couldn't yet explain. That sound could be more than sound. It could be power. She didn't know it yet, but those Sunday rhythms would one day announce her. The crowd would change, the drums would evolve, the city would modernize. But that beat, the one the Code Noir couldn't silence, would still belong to her. And if you're still awake to hear it, that means you've listened longer than most ever do. Don't just fade into the crowd, subscribe, so history remembers you before it forgets your name too. They say New Orleans remembers its ghosts better than its saints. By the time Marie Laveau turned 20, she was already a little of both. She had done what respectable young Creole women were expected to do. She married. Her husband's name was Jacques Paris, a Haitian refugee, one of the many who had fled the fires of the Haitian Revolution and washed up on the Louisiana coast with stories of kingdoms lost and gods that refused to die. No one knows exactly how they met. Maybe through church, maybe through family friends, maybe through fate's messy handwriting. What mattered was that he was respectable, Catholic, and steady enough to anchor her in a world that didn't like women drifting freely. They married at St. Louis Cathedral in 1819, under the same stone arches where her name would one day echo in myth. For a time, she lived like any proper wife. She cooked, kept house, prayed, smiled politely when spoken to. But if you looked closer, you could already see it. The stillness that comes from someone studying their surroundings, not surrendering to them. Marie was never the kind of woman to disappear behind a husband's name. And then, almost as suddenly as he'd entered her life, Jacques Paris vanished. Some said he drowned. Others whispered he ran away, unable to match her strength. The records, like the man, evaporated into the humid air of New Orleans. By 20, she was a widow. In most places, that would have meant pity. In New Orleans, it meant opportunity. Because in this city, a widow was not a tragedy. She was a mystery. In New Orleans, they like to say, a widow's veil doubled as social armor and excellent marketing. As the Widow Paris, Marie suddenly became someone no one could quite define. And that in New Orleans was a form of power. She could own property. She could work without permission. She could attend social gatherings without the suspicion that always followed unmarried women. And most importantly, she could move freely between worlds, respectable and forbidden, public and private. Freedom in this city came dressed in black. She moved back into the cottage on St. Anne Street, the one her grandmother Catherine had built, and filled it with light, noise, and people. Neighbors came seeking advice, blessings, or gossip, all of which she had in measured supply. She became a kind of quiet counselor to the Creole community. Widows, maids, shopkeepers, everyone had something to confess, and Marie had a way of listening that made people feel she already knew. She never judged. She didn't need to. She simply understood that human nature was more predictable than the weather, and both could be managed with the right precautions. At church, she remained devout, kneeling in the front pew, rosary in hand. But at home, another kind of faith began to take root. When her neighbors came sick, she brewed teas. When their children cried through the night, she hung small charms by the door. When a husband's temper grew too sharp, she burned bay leaves in the kitchen and said it was for peace. It wasn't rebellion. It was practicality. New Orleans, after all, was a city that prayed to God, but relied on Granny's remedies. And Marie, the Widow Paris, was fluent in both. Some say this was when she began learning from the older women, midwives, healers, freed Africans who remembered the old ways. They taught her how to grind herbs into pastes, how to bless oil before applying it, how to use a candle's smoke to read a room. Others say she didn't need teachers, that it all came naturally like a memory waking up. Whatever the truth, something in her deepened. She began to understand that faith wasn't fragile, it was flexible, that there was no sin in healing, even if the method didn't come with a priest's approval. Her small acts of kindness, the cures, the charms, the whispered prayers, began to ripple through the neighborhood. The Widow Paris can help, people said. She prays, she listens, she knows. Of course, the same rumors that built her reputation also sharpened it. Some called her a saint. Others muttered witch under their breath, though never loudly enough for her to hear. But Marie had learned from her grandmother. Let them talk. In New Orleans, reputation was a kind of perfume. It lingered even when you left the room, and it could be used to your advantage. If someone believed she could read minds, she didn't correct them. If someone claimed she could curse their enemies, she smiled politely and changed the subject. The truth was simpler. She didn't need curses. People destroyed themselves just fine when handed the right information, and she had plenty of that. As a widow, she began working quietly as a hairdresser, tending to the city's elite Creole women. It was honest work, respectable even, but it was also access. While she brushed and braided, she listened. The wealthy told their secrets as freely as they gossiped about others. Who was cheating on whom? Who was buying property? Who was in debt? To Marie, every whisper was a piece of currency, and she never spent carelessly. Freedom for her wasn't a loud declaration. It was quiet observation. Still, there were nights when the loneliness crept in. She was young, beautiful, and independent in a city that didn't quite know what to do with women like her. She could walk alone, but never unnoticed. She could pray, but not always be believed. She could heal others, but never quite cure herself of the ache for something more. It was around this time that she began lighting 2 candles instead of 1 before bed, 1 for peace, 1 for strength. The first flickered gently, the second burned steady and fierce, as if it recognized the woman who lit it. People would later call her the Voodoo Queen, but long before that, she was something subtler, a woman who'd learned how to command power without ever raising her voice. Widowhood didn't make her weak, it made her untouchable. Because in a city that adored appearances, Marie understood the secret no one else dared to say out loud. Sometimes, survival looks like mystery, and so she wore hers like a veil, black, beautiful, and impossible to see through. If power had a smell in 19th century New Orleans, it would have been a mix of rose oil, rum, and hair pomade. And if it had a chair, Marie Laveau owned it. She became a hairdresser for the city's elite Creole women, the ones whose fans snapped like thunderclaps, whose gossip could sink reputations faster than hurricanes sank ships. In the quiet intimacy of their boudoirs, Marie became something far more dangerous than a beautician. She became a confidant. Her clients trusted her with everything: their hair, their heartbreaks, their husbands' affairs. She brushed their curls while they brushed away their consciences, and as they spoke, she listened, patient, pleasant, and deceptively polite. While others powdered wigs, they said later, Marie powdered reputations. Imagine the scene: a grand parlor glowing with morning light, the air thick with the smell of starch and perfume. A bored socialite leans back as Marie pins her hair, muttering about her husband's mistress. Another brags about a property dispute soon to be resolved, unaware that Marie already knows who bribed the judge. One lady complains about her rival's new dress. Another whispers that she's expecting, and that the father might not be her husband. The city's secrets flowed through that salon like champagne, and Marie, ever the listener, never spilled a drop. You'd think she'd use it for scandal, but no, her genius was restraint. She didn't need to ruin anyone, she just needed everyone to believe she could. She used knowledge like fine jewelry, discreet but devastating when worn correctly. That's how she built her power, one braid at a time. She understood something the men of the city never quite grasped. Information was the real currency of New Orleans. Money changed hands, but secrets changed lives. And no one ever suspected the woman holding the comb. She never overstepped, never bragged, never gossiped aloud. Her clients saw her as humble, even simple, just a hairdresser. Which was perfect, because invisibility is the best camouflage for influence. She learned which priests had mistresses, which merchants were bankrupt, which families hated each other, but dined together anyway. She knew who went to confession for guilt, and who went for show. If sin had a hairstyle, Marie knew who styled it. It wasn't malicious. It was survival. The same city that praised her piety would have punished her pride. So she stayed careful. When people asked her opinion, she smiled and said nothing. When they tried to fish for her secrets, she gave them charm instead. Every whisper, every confession, every tear shed under her comb became a thread in a web only she could see. And when the time came, when someone needed help, or a favor, or forgiveness, she knew exactly which string to pull. If a wealthy woman's son was arrested, Marie might pray for him. If a judge needed persuasion, she might know someone to visit him. If a marriage was crumbling, she could offer blessed water that supposedly soothed tempers. And when those small miracles worked, and they often did, Her reputation grew. Soon, the city began to speak her name not in gossip, but in awe. "She knows things," they whispered, "things no one should know." What they didn't realize was that Marie didn't need supernatural powers. She just had perfect timing and an even better memory. She could recall who owed whom, who feared exposure, and who would pay dearly to keep appearances intact. The irony was almost poetic. These women hired her to make them look perfect, never realizing she was quietly rewriting what perfection meant. While the men of New Orleans played politics in salons and courts, the real politics happened in rooms with mirrors and curling irons. That's what made her so dangerous. She worked in the one place where high society actually let its guard down. And the beauty of it all? She never had to demand respect. She earned it, strand by strand, from the same women who would have crossed the street to avoid her in public. They adored her privately, but never admitted it publicly. To them, she was both servant and oracle. And that balance, the thin line between admiration and fear, was exactly where Marie thrived. She learned to keep her tone gentle, her humor dry, her eyes unreadable. She let them think she was merely sympathetic. In truth, she was taking notes on human nature, and she never misplaced a page. Every time a door opened to her, she walked through it quietly, collecting the unguarded parts of other people's lives. And the city, in its arrogance, gave her the keys without realizing it. Sometimes she used her knowledge to protect. She warned a servant girl not to take a job in a house she knew was dangerous. She helped a young mother avoid ruin by whispering just the right rumor into just the right ear. To those who came to her in desperation, she became more than a hairdresser. She was luck itself, dressed in plain cotton and carrying a comb. But make no mistake, she wasn't naive. Marie understood that gratitude faded faster than fear. So she balanced kindness with mystery, compassion with calculation. She made sure every favor left a trace of obligation. It wasn't manipulation, it was management. She didn't build her empire with potions and charms, not yet, but with something much subtler, the truth everyone else pretended not to know. And all the while she stayed composed, calm, devout, the perfect image of propriety. People began to wonder, how could one woman know so much? How could her predictions be so accurate? How could her prayers always seem to work? They whispered that she must have friends in high places, heavenly or otherwise. And Marie, ever practical, didn't bother to correct them. Faith, after all, was the most profitable rumor of all. In a city obsessed with reputation, she had become untouchable. No one wanted to cross her, not the rich, not the clergy, not even the law. Her influence stretched quietly from the mansions of the quarter to the markets along the river. She wasn't a queen yet, not officially, but her throne had already been built, out of whispers, favors, and perfectly coiffed hair. So when they later called her the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, it wasn't because of what she summoned from the spirits. It was because she'd already mastered the living. Love, in early 19th century New Orleans, was supposed to follow the rules. And if there's one thing Marie Laveau never did, it was follow the rules. By her late 20s, she had already learned how to survive alone. As the widow Paris, she was respectable enough for the church and mysterious enough for everyone else. But then came Louis-Christophe Duménil de Glapion, a name so long it practically needed its own address. He was a white Creole nobleman from an old French family, polished, educated, and utterly inconvenient. Their relationship broke every law and expectation in the book. Under American rule, interracial marriage was strictly forbidden. A white man and a woman of color could share everything except a legal signature. Society pretended not to see such unions. The law pretended to punish them. But New Orleans, being New Orleans, just shrugged and went about its business. Because here, defiance was almost a civic duty. No one knows exactly how Marie and Glapion met, perhaps through church or perhaps through the invisible network of Creole families that kept the city functioning while pretending not to touch. What we do know is that their connection was immediate and unshakable. Where others saw scandal, they saw possibility. They weren't supposed to exist, one historian later wrote, so they made a home that did. And that's exactly what they did. Their cottage on St. Anne Street became a small rebellion disguised as domesticity. It was a world of soft laughter, flickering candlelight, and the sweet chaos of children's footsteps. Neighbors gossiped, of course, about the arrangement, about propriety, about how respectable men didn't keep company with women like her. But respectability is just morality with better marketing, and Marie never bought into it. Louis, for his part, seemed unbothered. He adored her. He attended church with her, dined beside her, and treated her not as a mistress or secret, but as a partner. Their household was a quiet, stubborn act of love, proof that tenderness could exist even in the cracks of cruelty. And yet, the world outside their door never stopped reminding them what they were not allowed to be. For every kind glance from neighbors, there was another laced with disapproval. For every priest who blessed their home, another muttered under his breath. But Marie, unflinching as ever, refused to hide. She called him her husband, and he called her his wife. The law could label her whatever it liked. She'd already learned that names only hold as much power as you give them. They had children. Some records say 7, others 15, depending on which census taker was paying attention that year. The truth, as with everything about Marie, lives somewhere in between. Most of their children died young, taken by the fevers that stalked New Orleans every summer. Smallpox, cholera, yellow fever. They didn't discriminate between the poor and the proud. It's hard to imagine what that does to a heart, burying child after child, marking tiny graves that vanish beneath vines and time. But even in grief, Marie carried herself with quiet grace. She wore mourning clothes for years, though not for Jacques Paris. Perhaps in her own way, she was always in mourning. For the family she kept losing, for the city that never let her live freely, for the love that could never sign its name. Still, the cottage on St. Anne Street never fell silent. It was a house that hummed, with prayer, with laughter, with the steady rhythm of work. Louis repaired furniture. Marie brewed herbal remedies and tended to neighbors who came for help. They hosted dinners where no one cared about skin or status, only whether the wine was cold and the stories good. Their home became an island, a tiny republic where affection outranked law. Outside, the world grew harsher. The Americans, now firmly in control, imposed stricter racial codes. Free people of color lost privileges they'd once held. Marriages like Marie's and Louis's were condemned more fiercely than ever. The line between white and colored became a wall. But behind their door, none of that mattered. Louis never tried to elevate her into his world, and she never bowed to his. They met in the middle, where love lived, stubbornly, despite paperwork. And perhaps that was what made them dangerous. To a city built on hierarchy, A partnership like theirs was anarchy in lace and linen. They were living proof that the rules could be ignored, and worse, that happiness didn't require permission. There's a quiet humor in it all. You can almost imagine the conversations. Marie, brewing tea, teasing him about his noble French airs. Louis pretending offense, reading aloud from some pompous newspaper article condemning improper unions. They must have laughed, the kind of laughter that knows it's already won. Because what could anyone really do? Arrest them for affection? Exile them for peace? The truth is, they endured because they didn't fight the world head on. They simply built one of their own. Marie's life with Louis softened her, not her strength, but her edges. It's in this period that her reputation as a healer truly deepened. She tended to the sick, cared for her neighbors' children, and prayed for those the church ignored. Some said her power grew stronger in these years. Maybe it did. Maybe love has always been the best ingredient in any charm. When Louis fell ill in the 1850s, Marie cared for him the way she cared for everyone else, quietly, completely. He died in 1855, leaving her with debts, children, and a city that still didn't know what to make of her. But even after his death, she called herself Madame Glapion. The law hadn't recognized their marriage, but her heart had, and that was enough. It's easy to overlook the courage it took to live like that, not as a scandal or a symbol, but as a woman who simply refused to be told how to love. Marie and Louis never needed a priest's approval to sanctify what they had. Their home was their chapel. Their laughter was their hymn. Their defiance was their marriage license. They weren't supposed to exist, so they made a home that did. And in a city that worshipped appearances, they did something truly radical. They loved each other honestly. By now, Marie Laveau had mastered the art of moving through the world unseen, at least by those who only looked at the surface. To the casual observer, she was just the widow Paris, devout, well-mannered, a woman who kept her head bowed in church and her door open to anyone who needed help. But beneath that polite exterior, something older and far less polite had begun to wake. No one can say exactly when it started, when prayer began to feel like something more than words, or when medicine began to feel like conversation. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, Marie began to gather her circle. They weren't the sort of people listed in parish records. They didn't wear collars or titles, but they carried knowledge, the kind that had crossed oceans hidden in memory. There was Sanité Dédé, the midwife everyone in the quarter trusted, whose hands could coax both birth and healing. There was Marie Salopé, known for her herbs and her temper, who kept dried serpent skins over her doorway for protection. And somewhere in the swamps outside the city, there was Dr. John, a man equal parts showman and sorcerer, said to sell charms that actually worked and stories that definitely didn't. From each of them, Marie learned a little, not in classrooms or sermons, but in kitchens, in gardens, by candlelight. She learned to pray not just to saints, but through them, to find the spirit beneath the name. She learned which plants cured pain and which ones only looked like they would. She learned that a candle could mean 100 things depending on its color, its timing, and whose name you whispered when you lit it. And somewhere in that tangle of smoke, wax, and faith, she discovered something powerful. Command didn't always require volume. She could hold a room still without raising her voice. She could calm an argument by standing in the doorway. She could silence suspicion with a single look. It wasn't magic, at least not in the stage sense. It was something older, an understanding that authority doesn't need noise, it needs presence. Call it divine multitasking, someone once joked. She could pray to the saints and talk to the spirits in the same breath. And why not? In New Orleans, that wasn't contradiction. It was efficiency. The line between Catholicism and African spirituality was blurry at best, and Marie never saw the point in separating them. She kept statues of saints in her parlor. St. Peter for strength, St. Martha for control, St. Anthony for luck. But she also knew that behind those European faces were older powers, the Orishas, the deities of West Africa. When she lit a candle to St. Peter, she was also greeting Ogun, the spirit of iron and war. When she prayed to St. Martha, she honored Erzuli, goddess of love and beauty. And when she sprinkled holy water, she was blessing the same way her grandmother had, with intention, not just ritual. That was Marie's genius. She didn't replace one faith with another. She wove them together until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. Her clients thought they were receiving Catholic blessings. Her community knew better. It wasn't rebellion. It was survival through translation. By now, whispers had begun. Women who couldn't conceive came to her quietly. Men in debt sought her guidance. Those who feared curses asked her to remove them. The church might not have approved, but the church didn't visit the back streets at night. Marie did. She never called herself a priestess. Others did that for her. One evening, no one remembers the exact year, but the story has survived like all her stories do, half-truth wrapped in reverence. She agreed to help a woman whose husband had fallen mysteriously ill. The doctors had done their part. The priest had done his. Nothing worked. Marie arrived at the house near midnight. She brought a small wooden box, a bundle of herbs, a glass of rum, and 3 candles, one white, one blue, one red. She placed them on a table, crossed herself, and began to pray. Not loudly, not dramatically, just softly, steadily, like a song she'd known since birth. She asked for peace, for clarity, for forgiveness. Then she turned the rum bottle once clockwise, sprinkled water from her fingertips, and tied a small ribbon around the man's wrist. By morning, he was awake. No one ever agreed on what happened that night. Some said coincidence, others said divine intervention. But those who'd been there swore that the air in the room had changed, that it had gone still, charged, sacred. That was Marie's first ceremony, or at least the first that mattered. There was no thunderclap, no snakes, no crowd gasping in awe. Just quiet power, the kind that makes the hair on your arms rise without knowing why. After that, people stopped calling her Widow Paris. They started calling her Mambo, Priestess, Mother, or sometimes just the one who knows. And she did know, not everything, but enough. Enough to see the fragile architecture of the city's faith. Enough to understand that most people didn't want truth. They wanted comfort dressed as mystery. She became a master at both. Her cottage transformed into a place of ritual. Candles burned at all hours. The scent of tobacco and myrrh lingered in the air. Her clients would enter anxious, trembling, desperate, and leave lighter, calmer, sometimes even smiling. Whether it was magic or simply the relief of being understood didn't matter. The result was the same. She never claimed to perform miracles. She simply restored balance, and that, perhaps, is the closest thing to real magic anyone ever manages. By now, Marie's name had begun to travel beyond the quarter, whispered in markets, scribbled in letters, murmured in confessionals. Some said she could curse enemies, others said she could bless them. Both groups were right, depending on the price and the situation. But what no one could quite define was how she made people believe. Maybe it was her presence, calm, grounded, with that unnerving gaze that made you feel seen down to your smallest thought. Maybe it was her precision, every movement deliberate, every word measured. Or maybe it was that rarest of all things, authority born from compassion. Whatever it was, it worked. And as her candles burned low into the night, their smoke curling into the rafters like ghostly vines, Marie Laveau sat quietly in her kitchen, the air humming faintly with prayer, the city around her asleep. No crowds, no spectacle, no sermon. Just a woman who'd learned to translate the sacred, and in doing so, became it. There are nights in New Orleans when the air itself feels enchanted, heavy, humming, alive. Nights when the moon floats low over the water, and even the crickets seem to keep rhythm. St. John's Eve, the midsummer celebration of fire and renewal, was one of those nights. By the 1830s, word had spread through the city that something extraordinary happened every June along Bayou St. John. Hundreds of people, rich and poor, white and black, devout Catholics and quiet doubters, slipped away from their proper homes, their pews, their masks of respectability, and made their way to the edge of the swamp. They came in carriages, on foot, in borrowed boats. They came carrying offerings, rum, flowers, coins, fruit, prayers. What they came to see, though, was one woman, Marie Laveau. By now, her name was whispered everywhere, in markets, in mansions, in jail cells. She was the healer who could cure fever with a glance, the counselor who could make peace between enemies, the priestess who could summon luck. Some called her Mambo, some called her Mother, but everyone called her when life got complicated. And on St. John's Eve, they called her to the bayou. Imagine the scene. Torches flickering along the banks, the water reflecting the firelight like molten glass. Musicians playing drums made from hollowed cypress logs. Women swaying barefoot in the mud. Men clapping in time, the air thick with incense and laughter. Some came to dance, some came to confess. Others came just to watch, the curious, the skeptical, the secretly terrified. And in the center of it all stood Marie, barefoot, her white dress glimmering under the moon. Around her neck hung beads, shells, and a small gold crucifix. In her hands, coiled and calm, was Le Grand Zombie, the sacred serpent. A python, thick as her arm and longer than she was tall. Its scales caught the torchlight like polished bronze. The crowd fell silent. Even the insects seemed to pause. Marie lifted the serpent slowly, whispering words that sounded half like prayer, half like song. Some said she was calling to the spirits of the water. Others swore she was speaking to the snake itself. And then the drums began. Low at first, steady, heartbeat rhythm. The dancers followed, moving in circles, their steps measured, almost reverent. The air filled with a scent of rum and jasmine. The flames danced higher. Marie's voice rose above the music, smooth, melodic, commanding without effort. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Every eye, every heartbeat followed her. Some saw blasphemy, others saw salvation. The newspapers would later write. Either way, nobody blinked. From the shore, you could see faces illuminated by firelight. Planters' sons pretending to mock but unable to look away. Servants whispering prayers under their breath. Respectable matrons clutching rosaries and pretending they'd only come to observe. but none of them could deny the power in that moment. The bayou shimmered. The crowd swayed. The python turned its head as if listening. And for a few fleeting hours, the lines between sacred and forbidden dissolved completely. Marie moved through them like water, blessing some with a touch, others with a look. She poured rum onto the ground, offered bread to the fire, whispered a name into the night air. The drums shifted, faster, wilder. Then, just when it felt as if the whole world might spin apart, she raised her hands and everything stopped. The silence was perfect, and then came the laughter. Soft at first, then joyous. Someone began to sing. Someone else shouted a blessing. People embraced, cried, prayed. It was part revival, part rebellion, part group therapy under the moon. The next morning, the city would wake up pretending it hadn't happened. The newspapers would clutch their pearls about pagan rites and immoral displays. The church would warn about the dangers of African superstition. The police would pretend they'd tried to intervene, but couldn't find the place. And yet, when the next St. John's Eve arrived, the crowd doubled. It's amazing what people call witchcraft when a woman's in charge. Marie never advertised her ceremonies. She didn't have to. The power of myth handled her publicity. Everyone who attended went home changed, some trembling, some exalted, all convinced they had brushed against something beyond explanation. For the poor, she was hope. For the rich, she was fascination wrapped in fear. And for the city itself, restless, contradictory, half in love with its own sins, she was balance. Her rituals were never about spectacle. They were about connection to the land, the water, the ancestors, and each other. In a city divided by race, class, and law, her gatherings were one of the few places where everyone stood equal under the moonlight. She knew the power of symbols. The serpent she carried was never about evil, though outsiders, steeped in European fear of snakes, assumed it was. To Marie, Le Grand Zombie was life itself, rebirth, wisdom, the eternal circle. It was an echo of the African deity Damballa, the Sky Father, the Great Spirit who created the world. When she lifted that serpent above the crowd, she wasn't conjuring demons. She was reminding people, enslaved, free, or somewhere in between, that their gods had never left them. They had simply learned new names. That's what made her dangerous to those in power. She gave the city's forgotten people something they weren't supposed to have: identity, belonging, and awe. Even her enemies couldn't resist her charisma. There are stories of priests attending her ceremonies in secret, for research, only to leave her small donations afterward. After one St. John's Eve, a local paper described her as the most commanding woman in Louisiana, save perhaps the governor's wife, though the comparison flatters neither. Another article, less polite, accused her of bewitching the entire city. The truth was simpler. Marie had figured out what everyone else in New Orleans already suspected. The city didn't want salvation. It wanted permission. Permission to feel, to dance, to believe in something bigger than its own guilt. And Marie, barefoot in the mud, gave it gladly. When the flames finally died down and the crowd drifted away, she stayed by the bayou a little longer. Some said she prayed. Others said she simply watched the water, quiet and thoughtful, as if listening to something the rest couldn't hear. Maybe she was thanking the spirits. Maybe she was planning the next ceremony. Or maybe she was just enjoying the rarest luxury in New Orleans: silence. Either way, by morning, she was gone. The only trace left behind was a few melted candles and a faint smell of rum in the reeds. And by the next day, the the legend of Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, had officially been born. And if you're still here after the drums have faded, maybe the spirits aren't the only ones who stayed. Subscribe. It's the one offering the algorithm actually understands. By the 1840s, New Orleans had stopped asking who Marie Laveau was. It was too busy asking her for favors. She had become the city's unofficial queen, not crowned by gold or decree, but by consensus. 1,000 small stories made her throne. A fever cured here, a court case mysteriously dismissed there, a marriage saved, a rival silenced. If you lived in New Orleans long enough, you either owed Marie a prayer or knew someone who did. Her home on St. Anne Street had turned into something like a spiritual mayor's office. People arrived at all hours: fishermen, merchants, soldiers, ladies in lace, even the occasional politician who claimed to be just passing by. They came for blessings, for healing, for luck, for love, for justice when the courts offered none. She never turned anyone away, at least not right away. Her mornings began early, before sunrise, with prayer, candles, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead, which, some whispered, she occasionally did. After church, she'd walk home through the French Quarter, nodding to neighbors who crossed themselves as she passed. Children followed her for blocks, drawn to her calm authority, as if she carried gravity itself in her stride. Her front room was lined with candles, crucifixes, flowers, and jars of herbs that looked ordinary until you realized every label was in her own careful handwriting. People said that if you waited long enough on her porch, your problem would either be solved or seem smaller. It wasn't magic, not exactly. It was management, and Marie was the city's most efficient administrator. New Orleans, after all, ran on two forms of currency, gossip and gris-gris, and she had a monopoly on both. From the city's poorest alleys to its wealthiest salons, Marie was a name people spoke the way they spoke about weather, casually, respectfully, and with the underlying fear that she could change it. If you were a merchant worried about a shipment, you left a bottle of rum by her door. If your husband was wandering, you lit a candle to St. Martha and whispered Marie's name under your breath. If your rival was prospering suspiciously, you didn't complain to the authorities. You visited St. Anne Street. She was a mediator between rich and poor, sacred and profane, a priest and a judge in one body. And her methods were brilliant in their simplicity. If two neighbors were feuding, she'd invite them both to her home, listen quietly, then tell one to leave a white candle burning and the other to bring her an offering of flowers. A week later, they'd both swear the problem had vanished, which of course it had, because Marie had already visited their landlord. She understood that faith and strategy were not enemies, they were partners. The church, ever conflicted, didn't know what to do with her. On paper, she was devout, a regular at Mass, a godmother to more children than anyone could count. But she also led ceremonies the church couldn't explain. The priests grumbled, but when one of them fell ill, they quietly sent for her anyway. That was her real power. Not the rituals or the rumors. The fact that everyone eventually needed her. Even the city's most powerful white men, the same ones who mocked her in daylight, came knocking at night. A judge's wife seeking forgiveness. A banker begging luck. A plantation owner asking for peace from dreams he refused to confess. Marie listened to them all, and she remembered every word. Her reputation stretched so far that her predictions became city folklore. When a trial was coming, people would whisper, "Ask Marie." If she said the defendant would walk free, you could already start the celebration. If she said guilty, even the lawyers gave up early. She never explained how she knew. Some said she had informants, servants and hairdressers scattered through the city, all loyal to her. Others swore it was divine revelation. Maybe it was both. She was a master of information. The same skill that had made her a formidable hairdresser now made her an oracle. The difference between gossip and prophecy, after all, was timing. Her fame began to spread beyond Louisiana. Travelers wrote about her. Journalists described her with fascination and fear. One 1850s article called her the living symbol of the city's strange soul. It wasn't entirely wrong. She embodied New Orleans itself, beautiful, unpredictable, reverent, defiant. A city in human form, and her followers grew. On Sundays after Mass, they'd visit her home to light candles or seek advice. On feast days, her inner circle, women she'd trained, trusted, and sometimes terrified, helped her prepare rituals that blended Catholic hymns with African chants. To outsiders, it looked chaotic. To those who understood, it was harmony, every note of faith tuned to the same purpose, balance. Marie had become the queen of voodoo, but her reign wasn't defined by curses or spectacle. It was defined by order. In a city addicted to contradiction, she was the only one who made its opposites coexist. White and black, church and ceremony, science and superstition, sin and salvation. All roads led back to her. Her home became a refuge for women, especially those society preferred to forget. Wives trapped in cruel marriages, mistresses cast aside, servants accused of theft, free women of color navigating laws designed to limit their freedom. They all came to her, and she helped them, not because she claimed divine duty, but because she remembered what it meant to have none. She gave advice, money, jobs, and on rare occasions, justice that the law wouldn't provide. Sometimes justice looked like a prayer. Sometimes it looked like a rumor. And sometimes it looked like a terrified man realizing his secret had somehow reached her before he did. She was feared not because she threatened punishment, but because she didn't need to. Everyone knew she could, and that was enough. Still, she never seemed cruel. Visitors described her as serene, almost maternal. Her laughter was soft, her manner gracious. She had that particular kind of authority that didn't demand obedience. It simply made it impossible to refuse. By the time she reached middle age, Marie Laveau had become something the city had never seen before, a black woman whose influence transcended every barrier America had built. And New Orleans accepted it, because deep down, it needed her. The city was chaos, and she was its balance. She mediated between heaven and earth, between the powerful and the powerless, between what people prayed for and what they actually wanted. And as much as the city loved to gossip about her, the rituals, the whispers, the impossible stories, everyone knew the truth. She didn't rule by fear. She ruled by permission. Because as every New Orleanian eventually learned, power isn't about being obeyed. It's about being needed. And Marie Laveau, she was indispensable. The problem with power, especially when you're a woman who isn't supposed to have any, is that people will invent explanations for it. And by the mid-1800s, Marie Laveau had become more explanation than woman. Her fame had spread far beyond New Orleans. Her name traveled faster than fact, carried by gossip, fear, and the creative imagination of white men who needed her power to make sense to them. In polite society, she was the topic whispered about between sips of wine, The Voodoo Queen, the Black Witch, the woman who ruled a city with candles, snakes, and scandal. Newspapers printed wild tales about midnight orgies, blood rituals, and women dancing naked under the moonlight. Apparently, anything with drums after sunset was a moral emergency. The same journalists who never set foot near the bayou described it as a den of devil worship. Ministers warned their congregations that heathen influence was spreading. Respectable women gasped in horror, and then hired her the next week to fix their love lives. It was hypocrisy of the highest quality, and New Orleans, being the connoisseur that it was, served it with pride. To them, Marie was whatever they needed her to be. To some, she was a sorceress. To others, a saint. To most, she was entertainment, an exotic story they could tell at dinner without ever having to understand it. And Marie, who knew better than anyone how stories worked in this city, didn't fight the myth. She shaped it. Mystery, after all, was armor. The less people understood, the more careful they became. And when you live in a world that punishes women for power, it's far safer to be feared than pitied. If they wanted a queen who ruled by candlelight and whispered to snakes, she gave them one. But she also knew how to use their fear. When gossip about her ceremonies filled the newspapers, Marie didn't hide. She made sure the stories stayed just believable enough to keep her untouchable. If the city wanted spectacle, she gave it performance, carefully staged, never accidental. Sometimes she'd arrive at church dressed all in white, surrounded by women carrying candles, her head high, her face calm. The crowd would part like the Red Sea. People claimed her eyes could pierce through sin, that she could predict your future just by greeting you. She didn't correct them. She knew the secret that every great leader eventually learns. Reputation is free protection. If the city thought she could curse its enemies with a glance, who in their right mind would try to harm her? And so, while journalists wrote about ritual madness, Marie went on blessing babies, visiting the sick, and making herbal tonics that worked better than most doctors' prescriptions. That's the part the newspapers left out. For every scandal printed, there were a dozen quiet acts of kindness they ignored. She prayed with prisoners before executions. She brought food to orphans and medicine to those who couldn't afford it. When yellow fever swept the city, she risked her own life nursing the sick, not for attention, but because she'd always believed healing was the closest thing to holiness. But the press preferred the fantasy. It sold more copies, so they painted her in contradiction, half angel, half monster. One editorial called her a devil in silk. Another described her dark congregation of sinners as proof that civilization must be defended. The irony, of course, was that these same men had likely sent servants to her the week before to request good fortune before a business deal. Racism disguised itself as religion. Misogyny dressed up as morality. The white elites of New Orleans couldn't reconcile their fascination with their prejudice, so they told themselves they were horrified, even as they lined up at her door. Marie didn't waste her time trying to prove them wrong. She had better things to do, like feed the poor, pray for the desperate, and keep her city in one piece. Still, the myths multiplied. Some said she slept in a coffin to commune with spirits. Others claimed she owned a book of spells bound in human skin. One particularly dramatic rumor insisted she kept the severed hand of a murderer in her parlor. It was all nonsense, of course, but delicious nonsense, and that made it unstoppable. Even her looks became exaggerated. Some described her as tall and regal. Others said she was terrifyingly beautiful. A few swore she could appear in two places at once, leading a ceremony by the lake while also praying in church downtown. People loved her omnipresence almost as much as they loved pretending to disapprove of it. The truth was far less theatrical. Marie was simply efficient. She delegated, trained others, and let rumor do the rest. When she sent her followers, other women, often free women of color, to lead rituals or heal the sick, the city assumed it was all her doing. In a way, it was. Her influence had become so vast that even other people's miracles carried her signature. And through it all, she remained calm. She knew the danger of being too visible, especially as a black woman in an America growing less tolerant by the year. So she walked a tightrope, maintaining her Catholic devotion in public while letting her private faith bloom quietly behind closed doors. The priests still frowned, of course, but they couldn't quite condemn her. Not when she filled the pews and donated to the church. Not when half their congregation owed her their sanity. It must have frustrated them, the way she existed beyond definition. Too pious to be condemned, too independent to be controlled. Marie wasn't fighting the church or the government or even her critics. She was outliving them. The myths only made her more immortal. And maybe that was the greatest irony of all, that the same city that tried to turn her into a villain ended up turning her into legend. Because while the white elites were busy writing warnings, she was writing legacy. While they were clutching their rosaries, she was holding hands with the dying. While they were preaching fear, she was practicing faith. Faith in people, in compassion, in the idea that no one's too far gone to be healed. That was her quiet rebellion. So when you read those old accounts, all fire and brimstone, all scandal and shock, remember what they left out. The drums weren't devils. The women weren't sinners. The bayou wasn't evil. It was freedom, disguised as ritual. And Marie Laveau understood freedom better than anyone. She didn't correct the myths. She let them breathe, knowing they would outlive her body and protect her memory. The world remembers monsters far longer than saints, and she had no intention of being forgotten. So, she gave New Orleans exactly what it wanted, a story too wild to ever die. There are moments when a city's grandeur collapses into something smaller, quieter, like a heartbeat slowed by grief. For New Orleans, that moment came every few summers, when the air turned heavy and death walked with the heat. Yellow fever. It came with the ships. It always did. Silent, invisible, patient. The river would shimmer gold in the sunlight, and yet half the city would already be dying. By the mid-1800s, the epidemics had become routine. Doctors packed up their families and fled upriver. Priests whispered last rites until their voices gave out. Coffin makers worked by torchlight, the streets filled with the sound of bells, carts, and prayer. And in the middle of it all, walking calmly through the fevered chaos, was Marie Laveau. No veil of mystery this time, no drums, no ceremonies beneath the moon. Just a woman with rolled sleeves, a basket of herbs, and a reputation for showing up where others didn't. When most of New Orleans hid indoors, she went door to door, tending to the sick, comforting the dying, praying for the ones she couldn't save. The church prayed for mercy. Marie brought it in a bottle. Her medicine wasn't the kind that came from Europe. It came from the swamp, from the gardens, from centuries of memory. She made teas from sassafras and magnolia bark, poultices from mint and camphor, infusions of bay leaves, cloves, and oil. She burned incense not for spectacle, but to ease the stench of decay. Somehow, her patients survived more often than those under a doctor's care. Doctors scoffed, of course. Coincidence, they said, before quietly sending their servants to fetch her recipes. It wasn't sorcery. It was skill, a kind of healing born from listening. She knew which plants cooled the body, which soothed pain, which made breathing easier. She learned from the elders, the midwives, the enslaved healers who had carried their knowledge across the ocean. And when medicine failed, she offered something rarer: presence. She held hands when others refused to touch. She sang hymns when no one else could speak. Sometimes that was all it took. If you were a child feverish in a dark room, and you woke to find Marie Laveau beside your bed, her voice low, her hand cool on your forehead, you might have believed you were already in heaven. And maybe that was part of her power. She blurred the line between the sacred and the human, between ritual and compassion. Her prayers weren't meant to impress. They were meant to comfort. She spoke to God the way most people spoke to friends, directly, without ceremony, as if she had a standing appointment. And the city noticed. Every epidemic left behind new converts. Families who'd once sneered at her superstitions now lit candles in her honor. Even the priests, reluctant as ever, began to soften. One was heard saying that perhaps God hears her first. When the fever peaked in 1853, it was said that 1 in every 10 residents of New Orleans died. Entire neighborhoods emptied. The rich fled north. The poor buried their own. And through it all, Marie walked the streets with her basket, her herbs, her calm. People began to call her the angel of the fever. Others, less poetic but more honest, called her the only one who stayed. It's a strange kind of sainthood, the kind built not on miracles, but on attendance. While the church prayed for mercy from the pulpit, she delivered it one house at a time. Sometimes she prayed aloud. Sometimes she just worked. And if the patient recovered, she'd smile softly and say, "Give thanks to God, and drink more water next time." There was humor in her care, even in the darkest hours. A gentle wit that kept people from giving up. One neighbor recalled her scolding a man who refused her bitter tonic. "You'll die stubborn, or you'll live obedient. Either way, I'll be right." It was hard to argue with results. Her remedies spread through the city like scripture. Everyone had a Marie Laveau recipe, written somewhere, passed down, modified, half remembered, always trusted. And though superstition still swirled around her name, her compassion turned her into something more than myth. She became proof that faith wasn't just belief, it was service. She prayed with her hands as much as her lips. Her healing became a form of worship. And for a city caught between heaven and hell, she was both nurse and priest. The irony was almost divine. The woman accused of sorcery was the one saving souls. She treated everyone, the enslaved, the wealthy, the sick, the hopeless. There was no hierarchy in her compassion. Illness had already leveled the field. In a city obsessed with status, Marie practiced equality long before anyone gave it a name. And yet, she never claimed the title of savior. She didn't need to. Her actions said it louder. There's something remarkable about that kind of humility, about someone powerful enough to frighten governors but still willing to spoon-feed strangers. The legends loved to show her with candles and snakes, but the truth was quieter. The real miracle of Marie Laveau was that she kept showing up when the world didn't. When you picture her now, don't see the queen in white leading a ceremony under the moon. See her in the heat of a New Orleans summer, sweat on her brow, a faint smile on her lips, whispering a prayer as she wipes a child's face. See her exhaustion, her patience, her stubborn faith that love could outlast disease, because it did. Every fever she fought, every body she comforted, every life she touched, became part of the legend that outlived her. Not the legend of power, but the legend of care. When the epidemics finally slowed, the city looked different. The churches had new plaques, the graveyards had new names, and Marie's cottage had a new kind of reverence around it. People began leaving offerings at her door, not for fortune, but for gratitude. Candles, flowers, notes of thanks. And she, ever practical, accepted them with grace, then gave the flowers to the sick and the candles to the church. Her reign wasn't built on fear anymore. It was built on mercy. The woman they once called dangerous had become indispensable. And in the end, maybe that's the truest kind of power. Not commanding people to kneel, but making them rise. Power rarely leaves quietly. It fades, one candle at a time. By the time the 1860s arrived, the Queen of New Orleans had grown older, slower, and, though she'd never admit it, a little tired. The city she had once ruled with whispers and blessings had changed. The air still smelled of rum and magnolia, but something sharper lingered now. The scent of suspicion. The Americans were here to stay, and they had brought their laws, their order, and their unshakable fear of anything that didn't fit neatly in a church pew. Marie Laveau, the healer, the priestess, the peacemaker, was now a woman in her 60s. Her hair, once black and braided with shells, had turned silver. Her steps were slower, but her gaze still carried the same quiet command. Her cottage on St. Anne Street remained open, though fewer visitors came now, not because they'd stopped believing, but because the law had started watching. After the death of Louis Christophe Iglapion, her partner of decades, poverty crept back into her life like an uninvited guest. The debts he left behind were large. The world outside was growing harsher. The grand ladies who once whispered secrets beneath her comb were gone, replaced by a younger generation too American to remember gratitude. Voodoo, once tolerated as a local curiosity, was now criminalized under new ordinances. The same ceremonies that had once drawn crowds under the moonlight were now branded as immoral gatherings. Police raided the bayous, seized drums, and scattered her followers. They banned the drums, Marie once said, half smiling. But they couldn't ban belief. So she adapted. She always did. Gone were the public rituals, the blazing torches, the serpent held high beneath the stars. In their place came quiet evenings of prayer, soft candlelight flickering against the worn walls of her home. She still healed, still listened, still worked her quiet miracles, just now behind closed doors. Those who knew where to knock would still find her, sitting near the window, rosary in one hand, cup of tea in the other, a faint scent of bay leaves and wax in the air. Her hands trembled more now, but her mind remained sharp as ever. She could still recall every recipe, every chant, every face she'd ever helped. She had become something rarer than myth. She was a living memory. Visitors described her as kind but distant, like someone already half in the next world. She spoke of heaven often, but never with fear. Death, to her, wasn't an ending, just another doorway, another house where she'd eventually light the candles again. There's a particular sadness in watching your own legend move faster than you. By the 1870s, the newspapers still used her name, but not her truth. Stories began to blur. They said she could appear in two places at once, They said she was immortal. Some even claimed she had died years ago but continued to walk the streets. The myth was already outliving its maker, and in a way, that must have stung, not because she wanted fame, but because she'd built her power on connection. To see her face turned into symbol, stripped of her humanity, was a kind of erasure. Yet, she never corrected it. Maybe she knew that once a city begins to dream about you, arguing is useless. Her daughter, also named Marie, and strikingly similar in face and spirit, began to carry on some of her work. But the younger Laveau's methods were louder, more theatrical. The rituals became performances, and the crowds grew hungry for spectacle. The two Maries, mother and daughter, became entangled in rumor. Some said the younger was the elder's spirit returned. Others said they were one and the same, ageless, eternal. Marie, the elder, found it amusing. "If they want two of me," she once murmured, "let them pay double." But beneath the humor, there was weariness, the kind that seeps into your bones after decades of service, faith, and survival. She had carried New Orleans on her back through plague, prejudice, and politics. And now, as her strength waned, she watched her city stumble toward modernity, noisier, rougher, less enchanted than before. The world had grown too literal for her kind of magic. Even her beloved Congo Square, once alive with rhythm and dance, now echoed with silence. The city fathers had banned drumming entirely, claiming it was uncivilized. The square still existed, but it felt embalmed, a memory of itself. Still, in the evenings, you could find her there sometimes, sitting on a bench, watching the shadows lengthen, lips moving in silent prayer. The children who passed her never realized they were walking past history. She didn't mind. Queens rarely announced their exits. As her health declined, she focused more on prayer and less on power. Neighbors saw her attending Mass daily, kneeling with the same humility she'd shown when she first began. To outsiders, it looked like repentance, as if the Voodoo Queen had finally returned to the fold. But those who knew better saw something else: integration. She'd never belonged to one world, and she wasn't about to start now. She prayed to saints and spirits alike, lighting a candle to St. Peter while leaving offerings for Damballa. She died as she'd lived, walking the line between faiths and never tripping once. In her final years, she often spoke of balance. "Everything has two sides," she told a friend. "The drumbeat and the silence, the prayer and the answer, the queen and the servant. They're all one thing, just seen from different directions." It was her final lesson, and the truest one. When she finally passed, sometime around 1881, the newspapers wrote as though the city itself had gone into mourning. Some said 20,000 people attended her funeral. Others said her coffin was empty, because she'd never really died. Both versions were true in their own way. Because by then, Marie Laveau had already split in two: the woman who slept and the legend who never would. She had carried two worlds her entire life: the visible and the unseen, the holy and the haunted, and in death, she finally laid them both down. The myth continued walking. The woman, at last, rested. You followed her this far, from legend to life, from faith to fatigue. Don't fade out now. Subscribe before this story does what she couldn't: disappear quietly. June 15th, 1881. New Orleans woke that morning as if the air itself remembered to be quiet. Even the river seemed subdued, its usual murmur dulled under the weight of heat and history. Word had spread through every corner of the city: Marie Laveau was dead, and for once, everyone believed the same rumor. They came from every part of the city to say goodbye. Creole widows in black lace, dock workers in patched shirts, market women carrying baskets of flowers, priests, judges, midwives, merchants, and even the occasional former skeptic who had once sworn she was the devil's right hand, but now crossed himself and muttered, "God rest her soul." By midday, St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 was overflowing, a maze of marble tombs, iron gates, and humidity so thick it felt alive. The streets around it were crowded with carriages, mourners, and curious onlookers who didn't know if they'd come to witness a funeral or an event. New Orleans buried its queen, and immediately began arguing whether she'd stay buried. They said 20,000 people attended. That number, like most things about her, probably doubled in the retelling. But the crowd was real, vast, restless, and reverent. It was the kind of crowd you only saw for kings, saints, and scandals. The church bells tolled slowly as the coffin was carried through the gates. It was a simple one, wooden, modest, without gold or inscription. The city's most legendary woman left as she had lived, adorned not by luxury, but by faith. The procession moved through the narrow aisles between tombs, winding like a river through stone. On one side stood the wealthy, holding parasols and kerchiefs to block the sun. On the other, the working poor, bareheaded and solemn. Between them, no separation at all. Death, as always, was the great equalizer. A light drizzle began to fall, thin, almost polite, tapping gently on marble and metal. Someone whispered that even the heavens were weeping. Someone else muttered that it was just New Orleans being dramatic again. Both were probably right. As the casket was lowered, the priest began his Latin rites, but the crowd murmured prayers in every language. Some crossed themselves, others whispered invocations to spirits. You could hear fragments of the rosary tangled with words that didn't belong to any church, a blending of faiths, exactly as Marie had lived it. At the edge of the ceremony, a few women began to hum, low, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. The melody carried softly through the cemetery. It wasn't the grand sound of Congo square drums or bayou chants, but something smaller, more intimate, a memory in song. The priest frowned. The crowd smiled. Because everyone knew, even in death, Marie Laveau refused to stay confined to one kind of prayer. Some swore they saw a white dove land on her tomb that day. Others said the air turned suddenly warm, even as the rain fell. There were claims of candle flames that wouldn't go out, and of a faint scent of flowers, though no one had brought enough to explain it. The city, being itself, took all of this as confirmation that she was already busy working from the other side. Within hours, stories began to spread. Someone said they saw her shadow walking along St. Anne Street that evening. Another swore her voice was heard humming near the bayou. By nightfall, at least 3 people claimed to have dreamt of her, smiling, calm, saying simply, "I'm not gone, just moved." That's the thing about legends. They don't die. They relocate. As the mourners dispersed, the cemetery remained strangely alive. People lingered, touching the tomb, leaving small tokens, coins, candles, beads, and handwritten prayers tucked into cracks of stone. A few bold ones drew chalk X's on the marble, a habit that would soon become ritual. "Make a wish," someone whispered, "and if she likes you, she'll grant it." It was superstition, of course, but in New Orleans, superstition was just faith, with better storytelling. Over the following weeks, visitors continued to arrive. Women prayed for lovers, Men prayed for luck. The sick prayed for strength. Even the skeptics found themselves drawn to that tomb, as if curiosity itself counted as devotion. And though no one could prove it, there were whispers that good things happened afterward. Lost items found, debts forgiven, fevers broken. The newspapers printed the funeral as front-page news. Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen, passes at age 79, one headline read. The article called her the most mysterious woman in the South, and then, with exquisite hypocrisy, praised her charity and devotion. The same people who had once mocked her were now eager to claim her as their own. A few insisted she hadn't died at all. "I saw her just last week," one man told a reporter, "walking on Rampart Street clear as day." Others agreed. "Alive or dead, it makes no difference," an old woman said. "If you pray to her, she listens." And maybe that's how she preferred it. In life, she'd blurred every line between races, between faiths, between fear and reverence. In death, she simply blurred one more. As the years passed, her tomb became one of the most visited sites in the South. Some came out of curiosity, others out of devotion. Some left flowers, others left bottles of rum or notes written in pencil. A few swore they heard faint drumming at dusk, not loud, just enough to stir the air, rain on marble, murmured prayers, fading drums in the distance. New Orleans never really stopped worshiping her. It just learned to do it quietly. And in that stillness, she remained. The queen who had ruled without a crown, the healer who defied her own mythology, the woman who turned faith into freedom. Because in a city built on contradictions, Marie Laveau was the one truth that never died. Belief itself is the greatest rebellion. It's been well over a century since they laid Marie Laveau to rest, but in New Orleans, rest has always been a negotiable concept. Her grave, a modest above-ground tomb in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, became a destination almost immediately. Pilgrims came first, then tourists, then tour guides with microphones and matching shirts. What began as a place of quiet prayer turned into a kind of open-air confession booth, part shrine, part attraction, part social experiment in how long humans can whisper before breaking into selfies. They call it the cult of the tomb. You can still see it today, the white plaster streaked with charcoal X marks, hundreds of them, layered over generations, some drawn with reverence, some carved with keys, others scrawled hastily by nervous hands who didn't want to be caught. The tradition goes like this: mark 3 X's, make a wish, turn around, and leave an offering. Flowers, coins, rum, lipstick tubes, beads from Mardi Gras, folded notes sealed with hope. The marble looks less like a grave and more like an altar built by everyone who ever wanted something badly enough to try superstition. It's touching in a chaotic way. Every X tells a story. A gambler praying for luck, a heartbroken lover begging to be forgiven, a student asking to pass an exam without divine intervention from caffeine alone. Some come for blessings, others for closure. A few just want to feel a little less ordinary, and if belief itself has energy, and in New Orleans it definitely does, then that tomb hums like a living thing. People still say Marie's ghost walks among the tombs at night, not in chains or mist, but in quiet steps and flickering candlelight. A few claim to have seen her, a tall woman in white carrying a rosary, her eyes bright as moonlight. Others hear only the faint sound of humming, the kind of tune that might have once drifted across the bayou. There are stories of her guiding lost visitors, especially those foolish enough to sneak in after hours. One man swore she saved him from a fall by catching his shoulder. He turned around, and no one was there. Of course, in New Orleans, seeing ghosts isn't unusual. It's practically civic engagement. Still, her presence feels different. Not frightening. Familiar. Like the city itself is watching you, quietly deciding if you belong. Local tour guides tell their stories with a wink. If you light a candle for her, they say, she'll listen. But if you make a promise and don't keep it, well, and here they pause, smiling. She's still got connections. And the funny thing, no one doubts it. Even the skeptics lower their voices near her tomb. Even the atheists take off their hats. You might not believe in Marie Laveau, but she believes in you. Or at least, she's paying attention. The line between faith and folklore gets blurrier every year. Some come looking for religion, others for novelty. The gift shops sell Voodoo Queen candles beside snow globes of Bourbon Street. You can buy Marie Laveau keychains, t-shirts, and even authentic blessings, mass-produced in factories, with excellent lighting and no ghosts whatsoever. And somehow, she'd probably find that hilarious. Because Marie always understood the economy of belief. She knew that power was currency, and stories were how people paid their debts. Now, her myth has become the city's most profitable export. Even the dead pay rent in New Orleans. You can almost picture her smirking at that. The woman who once turned gossip into influence, now turned into an industry. Bus tours roll past the cemetery with rehearsed reverence, and you can hear the guides say her name through their microphones. Marie Laveau, healer, priestess, legend. The crowd nods. Some snap photos. Others shuffle closer to feel the weight of it. And if you close your eyes for a moment, the street noise fades, and you might almost imagine her watching, amused, maybe a little flattered, but mostly bemused by how the living never quite let her go. And really, why would they? She's part of the city's DNA, the way jazz is part of its air and sin is part of its architecture. Her story belongs to everyone now. The believers, the doubters, the romantics, the historians, and the tourists who think voodoo is just a prop for postcards. But beneath the chatter and commerce, there's still something sacred about her memory. In quiet hours, when the cemetery is closed, the tours are gone, and the city hums its midnight song, her tomb returns to silence. The marble cools, the candles burn low, the wind slips between the walls with the faint scent of myrrh and rain. And if you stand there long enough, you might feel it, that subtle stillness that comes when a place remembers too much. You might think you hear the faint brush of footsteps behind you, or a whisper, not a word, just the sound of someone exhaling peace. That's when most people decide to leave their offering, just in case. Some scribble thank yous. Some ask for guidance. Some simply say her name aloud, the way you'd speak to an old friend. Because that's what she's become now. The city's oldest friend. The one who's seen every joy and ruin, every flood and celebration, and never left. Marie Laveau has become the conscience of New Orleans, part memory, part myth, entirely alive in spirit. Walk through the French Quarter at dawn, and you'll still catch traces of her. A shopkeeper lighting candles before opening. A grandmother whispering a blessing in Creole. A musician crossing himself before a performance. None of them will mention her by name, but you'll feel her there, woven through the rhythm of it all. She's in the laughter, the mourning, the survival. Her legend has outlived the fear that tried to bury it, the laws that tried to silence it, and the centuries that tried to forget it. She is what New Orleans does best. Remember beautifully. And maybe that's the truest magic of all. Not curses, not conjuring, but endurance. Because when you live in a city where even the air smells like memory, ghosts aren't gone. They're just locals. And Marie, she's the one who still keeps the lights on. Even now, she's still teaching lessons about faith, resilience, and the delicate art of being larger than the story that contains you. People still come to her tomb asking for blessings. But if you listen closely to the silence between their prayers, you'll realize what they're really saying. Help me believe that something, anything, still listens. And maybe she does. The Queen of the Dead never really abdicated. She just found a better view. And so, the story of Marie Laveau, New Orleans' most notorious, misunderstood, and beloved queen, comes to rest where it began, somewhere between prayer and rumor. She ruled no nation, but every whisper bent to her name. She led no army, but half a city would have followed her anywhere. Her power was never written into law, yet it lingered longer than any government that tried to replace her. From the bloodlines of the enslaved, she rose to spiritual sovereignty, not by conquest, but by compassion. She healed, mediated, and mothered a city that never quite deserved her. And when the world called her blasphemous, she simply kept lighting candles. You can still hear her story in the rhythm of New Orleans itself, in the tap of rain on balconies, in the slow sway of jazz at midnight, in the way strangers still stop to help each other on hot, impossible days. She's in all of it, not as a ghost haunting her city, but as a heartbeat that never stopped. Because Marie Laveau didn't vanish, she multiplied. Every act of kindness in defiance of cynicism, every quiet prayer whispered outside the walls of a church. That's her legacy, still at work. Maybe that's why her legend never truly ends. She was never just a woman of mystery. She was a woman of memory. And if you've stayed awake through her rise, her reign, and her afterlife, congratulations. You've survived the Queen's story. But more than that, you've given her what she always wanted, to be remembered not for fear, but for understanding. So, before the drums fade and the candles burn out, here's your part to play. Subscribe. Not for the algorithm, not even for me, but for the simple act of keeping stories like hers alive. Because history has a terrible habit of forgetting its women, unless someone refuses to let it. And if you've listened this far, that someone is you. Thank you for standing with the Queen, for keeping her myth breathing, her memory burning, and her story from turning to dust. Subscribe, support, and stay curious, because every time you do, another legend gets to live a little longer